Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. And I am very happy to welcome you to this episode. We have three fabulous guests. Alicia Garcia Herrero, who is a senior fellow at Bruegel, a think tank in Brussels, and an adjunct professor at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. You also have all have very long CVs, but I'll keep the short version this time. Welcome also to Tianlei Huang, who is a research fellow and China program coordinator at Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, a dear colleague of mine, and Professor Tu Xingquen, who is WTO shareholder, dean and professor at the China Institute for WTO Studies at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. A warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us today. So this is a year of election all over the world. We have soon elections to the European Parliament, the 27 countries who will appoint their members. We have an ongoing Indian election, we have later in the UK, and there's a presidential election in the US. And all these elections have, of course, a global impact. And these days, China is very much a subject of debate in several of these countries where there are election campaigns. Between the EU, the US, and China, there's been several high-level meetings recently. Secretary Blinken was quite recently in China, and so was the Chancellor Scholz of Germany. And President Xi Jinping also visited Europe last week in Paris, Budapest, and Belgrade. And of course, apart from the war in Ukraine and other global issues, both the US and Europe are pushing China to use its influence to push Russia to stop the war, but there are also a lot of trade tensions. They concern competition, security, unfair competition. And lately, we have seen proposal just yesterday from the US where the president proposed to impose tariffs on Chinese goods worth $18 billion. Also, the European Union is doing an anti-subsidy investigation vis-à-vis European Chinese electric vehicles. So China is very much at the center of this discussion. But how is all this viewed in China? What does China think? And what is the Chinese strategy and view to address all these subjects? This is what we're going to discuss today with our three guests. So let me start with you, Professor Tu. How is all this seen in China, the election campaigns in Europe, and probably more important for you, the US? Is there an interest, or is everything just focused on the discussions on tariffs and the economic competition?
Okay, thanks for this opportunity to join this interesting discussion. Of course, we are watching the elections in the EU and especially in the US. We are concerned about now it seems that the very high likeness of Trump's re-election. But we always believe that this is an internal affair. We can do nothing about it. And China has no means to influence US elections or other countries' elections. So we have to accept whatever outcomes of the elections. But as you mentioned, actually, just last night, a new tariff action on China was announced by the Biden administration. So it seems to us that, okay, whoever wins the election is no good for us. So even sometimes we even think that Biden is even worse than Trump, probably, because Biden seems to be more sophisticated. And so right now, what can China do is to prepare better for that. However, the problem is there's a kind of dilemma that the better China prepares for decoupling, U.S. decoupling with China, the more decoupling will be happening, because what China can prepare for decoupling is to reduce its dependence on the U.S. and then to decouple with the U.S. further. So this is a very difficult choice, actually. And so for now, I think this will be a kind of unavoidably a downward spiral or vicious cycle. So you can on the U.S. side, as I said, we can also see the ever upgrading and expanding decoupling actions, such as the raised tariffs and strict export control. And it seems that it's unstoppable. Right? It's always going on and going deeper. So I'm afraid that we have to live with it for a long time.
We'll come back to some of these issues, but Jianlei, how important is this for China's economies? There's been a long discussion whether China's economy has peaked or not, and what is going to happen. And of course, China trades a lot with the US and Europe and others. What is the situation for the Chinese economy today, and how will the tariffs influence it?
Thank you, Cecilia. It's great to be with you, Alicia, and Professor Tu today. Well, China's economic recovery from the pandemic simply has not been as strong as many have hoped it would be. At the center of its economic downturn is still the housing downturn, which continues to be a drag on its growth, and it has an impact on almost every aspect of the Chinese economy, from investment to consumption, from prices to local government finance, right? And it also obviously undermines consumer and business confidence, which remains very weak today. And domestic demand in China remains weak, and there is a problem with excess supply in many sectors, and all those problems are reflected in prices. So prices in China are not only low, but they're also dropping in many areas. And the housing downturn obviously plays a role. It contributes to the weak demand, and the excess supply is finding a way out through exports. We're seeing a surge in Chinese excavator export lately, for example. And there is obviously also some excess supply in clean energy areas, especially solar products. I mean, in EVs, I guess it's more debatable, but I guess there is more of a consensus when it comes to solar. Right? And Chinese exports in those areas are also rising very fast. Overall, Chinese export really took off since the pandemic. Although it slowed down quite a bit last year amid a slowdown in global trade. That said, I think we also need to acknowledge the fact that the Chinese economy has grown so big now that even though its surging exports can cause an earthquake in the receiving countries and their industries, for the entire Chinese economy, it's simply not big enough to be a main growth driver, right? Because China does export a lot, they also import a lot. And nowadays, more than 95% of China's output is driven by domestic demand, so domestic investment and consumption, and less than 5% is driven by external demand. And this has been the case for more than 10 years now. And going forward, China's growth will still need to rely predominantly on domestic demand to drive growth. So this kind of popular narrative out there these days about China is trying to rely on export and export solely to revive its growth is simply not realistic.
No, because both with the EU and the US, the export is much bigger than the import. And what do you think the effect of these tariffs will be on the economy? Maybe a little bit too early to say, but I guess there's a lot of speculation.
Yeah, well, I think those tariffs will definitely hurt the sales and profitability of those EV producers and producers of all those areas that saw new tariff hikes. Because those producers can sell at a much higher margin in the American and European, for that matter, markets. But we also have to acknowledge that China doesn't sell that much EVs, at least to the US. So the direct impact of those tariff hikes is actually quite limited. And China is also pursuing a diversification strategy now, like others, including the US. It's now exporting more to other middle income and lower income developing countries, emerging market economies, and it's exporting less to advanced economies as a group. Well, at the same time, you see it's trying to pursue self-sufficiency, self-reliance in key technology areas that Professor Tu just touched upon. So it's also hoarding a lot of high-tech products. We see lately, a surge in Chinese imports in those automatic data processing machinery, for example. So I guess the immediate impact on China's economy is actually quite limited. I think this tariff hike announced yesterday is more of a signal. It's more of a message than looking at the actual impact, looking at hurting China's economy.
And fitting very well into the election campaign as well. Alicia, in Europe, there are also discussions on this, and the maybe tariffs will not be as brutal, but it looks very likely that there will be tariff announcements quite soon. How do you see it from a European perspective, comparing a little bit to the debate in the US?
Well, I think we Europeans have a hard time raising tariffs, as you know very well. Because we are tied, rightly so, but tied by the WTO. And, this is something that Biden is clearly not taking into account. And national security trumping all of these measures. So there is a big difference in the justification of any tariffs we may raise, but also the rationale behind. I mean, why would we do this? And in that regard, I think Europe's approach to China's overcapacity, and we could discuss whether this is real or, whether we need to look at it on a forward-looking basis. Xi Jinping's own words when visiting Paris that there wasn't such thing as overcapacity. But if we take it very simply, by measuring the falling prices in solar panels or EVs is actually the least obvious case, to be frank. But you have wind turbines where it's very obvious, and solar. So I think for us it's really all about is there enough evidence, or at least this is the way we've framed it. Is there enough evidence to prove that the subsidies are behind that competitiveness which pushes prices down? And that's anti-subsidy investigation, WTO related, but also our own instruments, such as the anti-foreign subsidy, which is what is driving, in this case, the exit of European tenders by two major producers in China, LONGi and Shanghai Electric, just recently announced. By the European Commission. So, it's a different ballgame because we're kind of following what we've said we would follow. And I also wonder whether the actual investigations will have enough information to prove that this is the rationale, that subsidies trump it all. We might not be able to do that. I mean, based on my own research, subsidies in China, those we know, those that are, published in financial statements, are less than 2% of GDP. That doesn't mean there isn't other types of support, but we cannot measure it. So I think for me, and I finish here, the problem is that the EU has, I would say, even bigger concerns because in many cases we're an even bigger importer by now. But our instruments are not as blunt, maybe rightly so, but in terms of effectiveness, of course, we will clearly fall short of any effectiveness. So in a way, we're in the worst of all worlds because we're more affected, but we don't have the instruments that we can really use to prove our case.
So you don't see that there's a risk of a tariff spiral in Europe as well? I mean, there's been talk, you mentioned several products, but there's been talk about some medical devices as well. And then you have the ships and everything. You think that it will be now, of course, with the elections in just a couple of weeks, things are very, heated, but they will be over and there will be new times. So you think it will calm down after that, or do you see an escalation the coming weeks?
So to make a long story short, I think with the instruments we have, it will be hard to escalate because we are straitjacketed by those instruments. It's and then the question is, will we be okay to be straitjacketed, or will we break our own rules? And I think the latter will happen only late, if you ask me. I mean, when, of course, we have a much bigger bilateral trade deficit, when we really see that we can't do anything about it. But I think it's not going to be immediate because we have these instruments that we need to follow.
Professor Tu, what has the official line from China been to the communication yesterday from Washington? Has there been any signals about retaliation or what will happen if this goes through? Obviously, there's been criticism that this is not WTO compatible.
Yeah, sure. MOFCOM has made a statement about the
Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yes.
Yeah, for Ministry of Commerce.
Commerce. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, Ministry of Commerce has made a statement about the tariffs, and the spokesman said that the Chinese government will take resolute reactions to these tariffs. But I'm not sure what these actions will be actually. But as Tianlei said, I think these new tariffs will have limited actual impact on Chinese industries because we rarely export EVs to the US. Even Tesla doesn't export its products to the US back to the US because there are already high tariffs. And actually now many Chinese companies are kind of afraid to enter the US markets because there are a lot of uncertainties. Because exporting EVs is very complicated. You need to establish local service. Many Chinese EV producers don't dare to export EVs to the US right now. So as some analysts said, US tariffs are basically so-called preemptive to prevent the future possible exports of Chinese companies. And on other products, maybe we are exporting some batteries, of course, to the US. But again, the volume is not so big. So, and also, as you said, the total trade volume is about $18 billion US in last year. So in general, it's not that big, of course, compared with the original Section 301 tariffs. So now I think the major concern for us is not the impact, not the economic effects, but we are just opposing the action of the U.S. Because the action is against, of course, is clearly against the WTO rules, and also the U.S. government has repeatedly claimed that the U.S. does not want to decouple with China. But in reality, in action, the U.S. government has not has been doing this continuously. So, like as I said in the official statement, MOFCOM said that it is the U.S. action is against Biden's commitment to China or to President Xi. As I said, then in this sense, I think there will be some retaliation. Of course, the Chinese government need to do something to show its opposition to U.S. action. But maybe the reaction will not be so dramatic, be proportionate, I think. But of course, it's we need to wait and see. Yeah.
Any other views on this, Tianlei, Alicia? Do you think there is a willingness now? Of course, with election, it's hard to say, but is there a willingness to discuss the issue of subsidies at all? I know that the Chinese government has said that in the WTO they would be open to discuss subsidies, but of all kinds, including agriculture. And I know the now buried, or at least deep in the freezer, the EU-China investment agreement. There were quite some elaborated and ambitious text there on disciplines from both sides. Is this something that could come out again after the elections when things have calmed down a little bit? What do you think, Alicia?
Well, I think that first of all, on CAI, on the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, what we really had on subsidies there was mostly services, because supposedly industrial subsidies were already covered in the WTO. And it was really transparency about subsidies. So, it wasn't really a major, in my humble opinion, breakthrough. Of course, it was a starting point, but that was December 2020. So, people were happy with China exporting in the midst of our pandemic. It's a very different world. So I don't think what was agreed there would make any difference today, for the reasons I mentioned. So no, I think, and we know that we just published actually a paper at Bruegel on China's industrial policy, and I'm making a point that subsidies are the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we can chase them if we really want to spend our time doing something, but that's not where the action is. There's a lot of government-guided funds. There's many other ways in which China conducts industrial policy, rightly or wrongly, but the point is we don't have the instruments to capture all of that, either through WTO agreements or any other, including CAI. So for me, it's more like we know it's and by the way, we are also engaging in industrial policy. We're also starting this game.
The whole world, yes.
Big time. So it's like that train has moved on from our side even. So that's why I don't think it will be easy to sit at a table and discuss frankly about subsidies, because too much has happened since.
Do you share that view, Tianlei?
Absolutely. I mean, just to follow up on what Alicia said about China's industrial policy, it's even for Chinese economists, I guess it's very hard to track. I mean, like Alicia said, the Chinese government has really a variety of tools to nurture new industries, emerging technologies. Local government industrial guidance funds is one of them, right? There are so many of those guidance funds, by the way, thousands of them. And some local governments are very active investors nowadays in those new technologies. For example, the Hefei municipal government, Hefei is the provincial capital of Anhui province. The entire province is very heavily involved in developing the entire EV supply chains, from batteries to EV production, and it's also investing a lot in semiconductors. So all those equity investments, aside of outright subsidies, by the way, the subsidy program is also rather complicated. There are, in the EV space, for example, the government not only provides, local governments usually, not only provides outright subsidies to producers, right, cheap financing, cheap land, sometimes even free land in the case of Tesla. It also provides consumer subsidies, right? It also set up an entire ecosystem that's conducive to people buying those new energy products, right? It gives, for example, in big cities, it gives people a free license plate. And in places like Shanghai, those license plates can cost a lot of money if you buy an ICE car, right? I believe now average price per license plate is 100,000 RMB. So that's really a sizable. So it's in essence subsidizing consumers as well. So it's really hard to track.
And is this all this industrial policy, and of course we see it in many other countries, this industrial policy that with all its complexity, is this part of a new Chinese trade strategy as a whole, or does it run its own track? So because of course because of there are some challenges to the Chinese economy, obviously, and what's happening in the world. Is there a sort of new strategy forming, or does the party sticks to the old principles, Professor Tu?
Actually, China, I mean, especially before 1990s, I think the Chinese government didn't implement so much industrial policy. Actually, we learned this idea of industrial policy basically from Japan, from Japanese government, and also sometimes from Korean government. Because we saw their development in those major manufacturing industries in a short time. We believe that this is very successful. But I think before the 2000, the Chinese government didn't invest too much and didn't get much success from industrial policy. Actually, China announced some industrial policy like in automobile industry and in steel industry, but the actual outcome is not so good. And also in steel industry. So actually during Chinese WTO negotiations, industrial policy was not a big focus because, as I said, China was not so successful. I would argue that the major success happened in the new energy industry, including in solar panel industry and electric vehicle industry. But there are also some differences between the two industries. Like in the solar panel industry, at the beginning, in early 2000 years, the Chinese government announced that this is a promising industry. So encouraging all companies or local governments to invest in this industry, but not so much support from the central government, actually. But many local governments believe that this is, as I said, a promising industry. So they helped a lot of companies to invest in this industry and created a big production capacity. And in the early years, the central government did not support the use of solar panel or the new energy. So many Chinese producers, almost 90% of their production to other countries. So it created some trade disputes, right? Trade conflicts with the US and the EU. So as I remember, in 2011, 2012, the US and the EU and other countries imposed anti-dumping and countervailing duties against Chinese products. But after that, the Chinese government supported the consumption of solar panel or solar energy, invested a lot and also subsidized the establishment of those solar energy generations. Then actually the large part of solar panel production was consumed in China domestically. And in the EV sector, we didn't depend on exports at all from the beginning. So as Tianlei mentioned, the main approach of subsidization is to subsidize consumers. There are some other kinds of industrial policy instruments, but the main approach is consumer subsidies to develop a domestic market with also a lot of propaganda and marketing programs. So the Chinese market is actually for EVs has been the largest market for a long time. So the Chinese market consumes most EV products of Chinese companies. So we just actually exported EVs to the world market like 3 years ago. Very recent, very new development. So in this sense, I mean, the impact of or the impact of Chinese industrial policy on EVs has just been showing recently, very recently, but one thing I want to mention is that you could say that this is a success of Chinese industrial policy, but it depends on a lot of factors. And as I said, actually previously in the past, we didn't see much success actually. So just recently we saw some success, but with a lot of conditions. One big reason I would say is that EV industry is a new industry for the whole world, not only for China. So there are not so many incumbent competitors yet in the world market. And China's advantage is we move fast, we act fast. So we took advantage of this space or this time. We made some success, but it doesn't mean that China will be successful always. And also, as mentioned, Tianlei, Hefei municipal government is considered the most successful investor right now in China. But there are many failures in other cities, in other provinces. So maybe sometimes as I said, the impact or the success of Chinese industry policy has been exaggerated to some extent.
Do you agree with this, Alicia? And we also see that some parts of the industrial policy and the trade strategy is also sort of decoupling in the way that China is seeking more regionalization and increasing its trade with the Pacific and its neighbors. How does this fit into a more general strategy, and how will it affect the economy?
Well, I mean, I think China by now realizes that the West, and I think Europe is, of course, well behind, but in a way, the West is going to be a very difficult market for China for different reasons. And therefore, it's just a question of time. And also, frankly, many of these Asian economies grow faster than the West. So, it just makes sense. They have also signed a number of free trade agreements, as we all know, RCEP. China is queuing for CPTPP. It might not be very serious, but the reality is that they are there. They're present with their interest in Asia and beyond Asia. So I actually think that's kind of the way to go. And also because the pressure, if I may say that, especially the US, but in a way also Europe with investigations, that pressure cannot be easily replicated by emerging economies. Yeah, I mean, India is trying, Turkey is, but the reality is they don't have the industrial capacity. So in a way, yes, they can complain, but they still need to import from China. So for me, this is why the strategy is clearly and showing the West that the West is becoming smaller and that ASEAN is more important than the EU. All of these things are rhetorical but important because it shows the direction, and I think it makes a point that if we don't want this in the West, up to you. Eventually, you have the rest of the world to serve. So now the question is the West responding to this? Well, the US by no means. Yeah, they're still totally enclosed in its own market without trying to reach any trade agreement with anybody else. I think that's a very very difficult position to be, because China is doing the opposite. Yeah, so for Europe is moving ahead with more agreements, but I would say that they are still small markets compared to what China is doing. So we're not hitting Indonesia or India. I mean, all of these big differences. So for me, if China is doing this, our only response is to do it as well. I mean, to look for those big markets and compete in third markets. Frankly speaking, for third markets, there is no anti-subsidy investigation that is going to protect us. It's just about for some unfair competition, fair, unfair, I'm nobody to judge, but the point is we'd better be very fit for those third markets. Trade agreement will help, but that's by no means enough to have a role in those markets. So we really need to shape up and know that we won't stop China's industrial policy. I think there's no way we can stop and I just want to finish here by saying that my sense is that China really needs these markets. I mean, from my perspective, looking at the Chinese economy, hearing things that would even sound like potentially even QE one day, like really that idea that China will need support, monetary support for a long time, that rates will be low. I mean, all of that, without any structural reform, the only way is, the export market. So we need, Europe being a major export engine, we need to know this. So it's not only about our market. That's exactly. So we need to rush to these trade agreements. The US doesn't want to do it, so be it, but we should, by all means.
So Europe should do it, and China is doing. Qianlei, you have written about the need for structural reforms in China now with the economic situation. So of course, as was mentioned, the exporting parts of its overproduction is one strategy, and then there's the regionalization of your new partners and so on. But will this be enough to compensate for lack of structural reforms in a sluggish economy that is in need of reform? What's your view?
Well, let me first take a step back. I think if we look at the bigger strategy here, the longer term strategy of the Chinese government to continue its growth is really to explore ways to promote productivity growth. And it's looking at fostering those new technologies, indigenous innovation, and the diffusion of those new technologies in those areas, priority areas now identified as new productive forces, right? And it's not just about those EVs, battery, solar panels. We call this the new three. It's a really wide range of new technologies. I categorize them into three categories. It's about advanced manufacturing, decarbonization, digital economy. And aside from that, it's also about upgrading and digitizing the entire traditional supply chain. So it's really looking at a wide range of traditional and new sectors. But of course, more and more export restrictions and tariffs imposed by the US and others will be a huge obstacle for China to achieve its ambition. And the central problem, as you alluded to, Cecilia, is that this strategy it deprioritizes the demand side of the economy, and I think that's the key issue here. It overlooks the reforms that are really needed to push for more structural rebalancing of the economy towards more consumption-driven, right? And that's something that China really needs now, right? What China really urgently needs now is to empower its consumers through a wide range of demand side reforms to raise people's income and ultimately their consumption. And this contentious issue of overcapacity is simply a result of China's domestic economic imbalances, right? Without further structural rebalancing, its domestic imbalances will continue to spill out into the global economy and cause trade tensions. And there's a lot China can do. I mean, just look at how many poor people there are. I mean, there are 300 million rural migrant workers out there in the country. That's more than 1/5 of the Chinese population. They don't have an urban permanent registration, so they don't have equal access to public services. And it's really urgently need it's urgently needed to expand for local government, to expand the access to public services, to include those rural migrant workers. Their consumption now is substantially lower than their peers who do have living in cities, who do have a residence permit. And fiscal policy can play a huge role in this. Right now, we see the central government is now willing to take advantage of its own relatively healthy balance sheet to issue more debt to make fiscal policy more expansionary. And unfortunately, I think most of those money will continue to be used on infrastructure development, or more broadly, it will continue to be invested on stuff, not people, right? And I think that's a mistake. China does need to pivot more fiscal resources and spend it more on its people. And given the entire Chinese population is declining now, I think that's all the more reason why China needs to really rethink its overall strategy and pivot more resources to invest on its people to improve human capital.
And do you see any signs that this is going to happen?
Unfortunately not. I think, if anything, the political and economic imperatives that are driving China's policymaking nowadays seem to be defying that transition. By focusing so much on new productive forces and deprioritizing boosting domestic demand, I think that's really a problem. I think it's about the mindset of the Chinese leadership. They don't like such demand side support for households and consumers. They're worried about inflation or whatever. But what China needs to worry about is not inflation, but deflation. And it also has something to do with the entire fiscal and tax system, right? The Chinese government draws more tax from the corporate sector, not the household sector. So, whenever it wants to stimulate the economy, it focuses overwhelmingly on the corporate sector, right? Not focusing on the household sector. So, structural reforms that need to take place are really there are a lot that need to be done, starting from the fiscal system.
Do you see this happening, Professor Tu? You talked about consumer demand in your introduction as well. You think this will happen, and how is because some of these reforms will need to be made if China is to join the CPTPP, this big trade agreement with 12 other partners. How is this going right now?
I think actually among economists, there's some kind of consensus about, as Kelly mentioned, promoting consumer demands. But I think maybe one reason for why the government focus so much on production or new productivity forces is that there are some concerns about security. Because and one source is the U.S. actions actually of decoupling, because the U.S. has imposed many restrictions, especially technology and high-tech products exports. So there's big concern that this kind of action will have very negative impact on Chinese so-called critical industrial production, and it will also affect Chinese security or military capability, something like that. So the government has been trying to invest more in the development of so-called new productivity forces or production capabilities. And also technological development. So I think that's at least one driving force why behind the too much focus on production side. But of course, in terms of macroeconomic balance, we need to invest more in the demand side. We should allocate more resources to the demand side. That's of course, very, very important. But how to say? As I said, this this increase in concern about security or the so-called unreliable supply of high-tech products from the United States and also from the West is also a driving force behind that.
Well, I think this is on all continents. Security and trade is very much linked these days. But there's one area where there is still, open cooperation, where all leaders say that despite our different disagreements and tensions, we need to work on greening of trade and on trying to find ways to contribute to give greater access. Well, of course, then electric vehicles comes in here as well. But there's a lot, the span of green technology and of carbon pricing. China has an ETS system. Europe is now introducing gradually the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and there are discussions all over the world on this. Is this an area where you could see increased cooperation in the future, Alicia, where that could be used as a way to sort of neutralize some of the tensions? Or will the electric vehicle issue sort of hang over as a wet cloth?
Well, I guess on green and whether we can green our trade and all of that, I think the key issue is, what's next? I would put it this way. So we had solar panels, we had wind turbines. We Europeans thought we were dominating wind, and you were no longer dominating wind, even offshore wind. Is that, and then EVs. And then the question is, what about heat pumps? What about green hydrogen? So I think, while we all want to reduce emissions, we also want to have some industry that is successful within this goal. And I think it has to be understood that the only way to do this is to have some shared success on the industrial part. Because if not, by the mere fact that Europeans at the end of the day emit as much as India, the whole of Europe, it's not going to be sustainable. It's just not going to be sustainable that you only see the cost. There's carbon pricing, and yes, we may impose CBAM, but it's going to be a tiny thing. I don't believe that we're going to be, changing the rules of the game. We're too small to change the rules of the game. So for all of those reasons, I think the key for cooperation in this field is to go back to some kind of competitive advantage type of model, where you say, okay, you're going to do this, you do it very well, you have 90% of the market share globally, but I will need to do something where I don't need to have 90% of market share, but I need to be a relevant exporter. And I think these are the conversations we need to have, because if we don't have them, it's not going to be sustainable. I think Europe will start changing the tone, becoming much more protective, and therefore we will not reach the goals, because it is great that somebody produces with more economies of scale at a cheaper price. There's nothing wrong with that, but not to the point of producing everything with economies of scale at the cheapest price, because that model is not sustainable. It's never been in history.
So that doesn't make you very optimistic for the short-term future on cooperation. No. How do you see this, Tianlei? I hear both Secretary Blinken and Secretary Yellen are saying that we need to cooperate with China on green trade. This is if that was something sort of specific aside, but as both Professor Tu and Alicia said, this is so much linked to the green technology, to security, and others. Do you see a way forward there, possibly after the elections? Because until then, nothing really will happen, probably.
Well, I think it'll be really hard. Like Alicia said, we simply no longer live in a world where comparative advantage is the way people think of trade, right? And that's just the reality that we're living. And even after the election, I think we'll continue to live in such a world. And one thing I worry about is, perhaps a few years down the road, there will be overcapacity in those green sectors globally. Is that a good thing for for decarbonization, or is it a bad thing? I don't know. I mean, producing those green products also, is it causes carbonization, right? So I think that's something to be mindful of. Such overcapacity globally, what does it really mean for climate change? Yeah.
So how do we solve this? Professor Tu, you are a WTO shareholder. I mean, you've been writing and studying WTO a lot, and you also referred to it several times. And we know that well, in the US, the engagement for WTO the last years have not been overwhelmingly, if we say so. Could that be a way forward, if not now, on a little bit longer term, to continue reforming WTO and try to see if it could be a forum to solve some of these questions?
Well,
if only.
as you said, as a WTO shareholder, of course, I wish WTO could play a more important role in this respect. But I think, as you said, greening is a kind of common good for the world, for all the human being. So in China, Chinese people have kind of, for us, it's a little difficult to understand, actually. As you said, those trade disputes between China and the EU and the US about those new energy products, because we truly believe that we are making contribution to the world, to the greening of the world, because we are producing cheaper green products with less emission. But of course, as Alicia said and Kelly said, we have to be realistic. It's not only about greening; it's also about industrial competition. So every country wants to have a competitive industry in this new promising industry. So we have to live with this reality. But I think the WTO could do something about that. As you know, China has been active in those discussions about environmental protection in the WTO. We initiated a so-called plastic pollution dialogue, and also China was active in the environmental goods agreement negotiations. So for now, I think that the kind of the connection, the linkage between environment and trade should be accepted by WTO members or by the WTO. So we should work harder to find some positive relationship between trade and environment. And also in terms of industrial policy, like there are also some discussions about green subsidies or subsidies with positive impact on the green development. For example, like subsidies in those green industries or green products. And also China proposed to resume the so-called the non-actionable subsidy, this type. So I think for now, maybe the WTO should give more policy space to members to use some policy tools to encourage their green development. For me, I think, of course, there are some also discussions about so-called subsidy war or subsidy competition. But in my opinion, subsidy competition or even subsidy war is still better than tariff war or trade war. At least more subsidies could produce the faster development of green industries. Maybe there will be still some competition, but like as I said, in terms of China's experience in the development of EV industry, because the Chinese government usually uses consumer subsidies, so the government does not choose winners among the producers, among various producers. So producers still have to compete for the consumers. So market mechanism still works there, and it will increase the efficiency. So I think that's also one reason for the better development of Chinese EV industry. So I think the WTO still should work hard to prevent trade wars or trade restrictions, but could give more policy space to members to implement their domestic support policies.
Well, there's a lot to discuss on WTO. Obviously, we are running out of time, but there are two questions come from the audience. I think one is maybe more directed towards Qianlei. We touched upon it, and the other more geopolitical, maybe for Alicia. It's a long question, but it relates to, is China stuck in the middle income trap? Chinese producers cannot scale down productions due to internal incentives, so they need to export the excess abroad. This exported overcapacity affects other nations, exacerbated by the high volumes of China's export. In parallel, China tries to move to services and international consumption. And China seems to be stuck between old and new industry, and the Communist Party needs to protect old industries to maintain internal stability. So will China be stuck in the middle income trap? That is one question for maybe more for Qianlei, and I'll read the other one. I think Alicia maybe wants to comment on this. Is China really as concerned about the West as the West is about China? China ultimately wants to become the leader of the global South, as it is setting up a parallel supply chains and expands parallel political forces such as the BRICS. Meanwhile, China strikes back at the US and divides and conquer in the EU. However, China's reaction to the West just seems as a way to buy time, because Chinese think in the long term. Very complex questions, but maybe you want to say something about that before we round up. Qianlei?
That's a great question. Well, I think to use the Chinese leadership's words, their strategy nowadays is to establishing the new before breaking the old. So exactly like that question stated, right? It is firmly reliant on the old growth drivers at the moment, and they're seeking new alternatives, new growth drivers. But those new growth drivers are still too small to be real growth drivers, right? So it's kind of stuck in the middle now. It's in transition. That's the nature of this economy right now. And well, I mean, I think we'll still need to go back to the structural reforms that are really needed to put the Chinese economy, to put its growth on a more sustainable path. And those will require to do more on the demand side, not just focus on the supply side and the production side of the economy. I think that's really the key here.
Thank you. Lisa, do you want to give a try to the more geopolitical question?
Yeah, I mean, I understand that China has the global South. I mean, first of all, nobody has the global South. I mean, China may feel they have an upper hand on parts of the global South, but I think basically these are very different realities, nations. They'll take, we'll see how it evolves. So in that regard, yes, China has this narrative to argue that, the West and the rest, and the West is doomed, and we're small and smaller and smaller. But my sense is that China does worry about the West. We worry about China. There's no doubt about it. And we're obsessed. And,
sometimes, yes.
we shouldn't be. But I actually don't think that that's not the case for China. I think we're both overly obsessed. And I think it would be ideal if that global South, these other economies, make us realize that that they are really independent entities. I mean, whether it's India, whether it's Turkey, and because that would give room for Europe. I mean, for me, I always feel that India, in a way, is our hope, because if India really manages to break this great power competition between the US and China, I think Europe can have a similar role. I think it's very hard for Europe to start this game, while it might be easier for India because of its history and non-alignment, etc. So, I just hope that parts of that global South really stand up and say, you know what, we're big enough to do what we want. And that would break this dynamic, because as we stand, yes, China is too focused on us, we're too focused on China, no doubt.
Wow, you have given so much food for thought. All these questions are so complex and so difficult, and they're interlinked, and it's really hard to see what's going to happen on the short term and on the longer term. But thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your knowledge, your experience, and your thoughts on this. I'm sure we'll come back to this. And well, with the silly season of elections, it's hard to see any constructive way on a very short time, but hopefully after that. So thank you very much, Alicia Garcia Herrero from Rugal, Qianlei Wang from Peterson Institute for International Economics, Professor Tu Xingquen from University of Beijing, shareholder and Dean of the WTO Studies. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. Have a nice afternoon and continued morning.